By the time the rider reached for Clementine Vale's arm, she had already buried the hatchet in the chopping block, hard enough to split oak down the middle. "Touch me," she said, lifting her father's Colt, "and you'll finish this day with one good hand." The two men in Amos Reddick's colors laughed, until they saw she did not. Wind pushed smoke from the cook fire across the yard. The smell of split pine and horse sweat hung under a sky the color of tarnished silver. Behind her, the back door opened, and Gideon Vale stood there in the threshold, one hand braced against the frame, the other pressed hard to his ribs where the coughing had brought up blood at dawn. If you're settling in for the evening, wherever you are, draw a little closer and let us know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Hard stories feel lighter when we know who's sharing the fire. "Your business?" Clementine asked. The taller rider tipped his hat. "Message from Amos Reddick." That name changed the temperature of the yard. Amos owned cattle, judges, deputies, and men mean enough to confuse fear with respect. He also wanted the Vale River Bend, a strip of green land so rich a man could fatten weak stock there in a month. The shorter rider smiled with too many teeth. "Your father's note comes due Saturday. If he can't pay, Mr. Reddick will claim the ranch, the stock, and anything else carrying the Vale name. Anything else." The way he said it made the skin between Clementine's shoulders turn cold. Gideon coughed once in the doorway, and both riders heard how much strength had left him. "Saturday," the tall one said. "Best pray your father finds help meaner than ours." They rode off at an easy pace, as if they had all the time in the world, because men like Amos Reddick usually did. Clementine kept the Colt up until the riders vanished beyond the cottonwoods. Only then did she lower it and turn to her father. Ranch sun had long since weathered Gideon's face, but sickness had hollowed the man beneath it. He sat on the porch with the care of someone trying not to let his bones hear him hurting. "You should have stayed inside," she said. "You should have let me answer. That's not what they came for." His eyes dropped to the revolver still in her hand. "No," he said. "It isn't." Questions swarmed her. Why had Amos sent men before the note was due? How did he know Gideon was too sick to ride? And why did her father look older every time that name was spoken? He answered none of it. He only said, "Come morning, I'm sending for a man I hoped never to need again." The next day she found him at the kitchen table writing with a hand made clumsy by fever. "Who?" she asked. "Eli Mercer." The name meant nothing to her, which bothered her more than if it had. "What sort of man is he?" Gideon folded the note before the ink was dry. "The sort who's done terrible things for the wrong people, and the only man Amos ever feared." "You're hiring a killer?" "I'm hiring the reason you may still be alive on Sunday." He paid a ranch hand to take the letter north, toward Bitter Pass. After that there was nothing to do but wait, and waiting is ugly work when danger has already learned the road to your gate. Clementine threw herself into chores. She fed hens, mended tack, checked the lower fence. Near dusk she found the west gate unlatched and fresh mud in the hinge. Someone had tested the boundary. When she lifted her head, a rider sat black against the ridgeline, watching the house. He turned and vanished into the pines before she could reach for the rifle on her saddle. That night she slept in her clothes with the Colt under her pillow and woke twice certain she had heard boots on the porch. Eli Mercer arrived the following noon. He came alone on a dun horse with a carbine across the saddle and a coat bleached by dust and old weather. He was not what Clementine expected. There was a scar at his jaw and another nicking one eyebrow. He carried himself like a man who had learned to count windows before entering any room. But his eyes were not cruel. They were careful, tired, like he had not laid his past down in years. "You Mercer?" she called. "I am. You're late. Been hearing that since Missouri." Then Gideon stepped onto the porch, and for a moment neither man spoke. Whatever lay between them was older than the ranch, older maybe than the grief in both their faces. Inside, over coffee gone bitter on the stove, Gideon told the story plain. Drought had wrecked the herd 3 years earlier, a hard winter followed, then the sickness. He had borrowed against the land through Amos to save the ranch, and Amos had stopped wanting money months ago. "He wants the river bend," Gideon said, "and he wants to punish me for saying no when I was still strong enough to say it." "How many men?" Eli asked. 6 close. More if he smells weakness, and the sheriff, bought in spring." Eli nodded once. "Then I stay until this is finished." Clementine crossed her arms. "That simple?" "No," he said, "just final. By evening he had walked the fence lines, checked the loft, counted shells, and moved the spare rifles into the kitchen. He worked without swagger, and the ranch seemed to settle into new shape around him, as if danger that had been drifting in the air had finally found edges. At supper, Gideon's coughing bent him nearly double. Eli rose before Clementine did, steadying the old man, turning the coffee aside so it would not spill. He did it with the easy competence of someone who had tended suffering before. Later, after Gideon slept in his chair, Clementine found Eli at the table drawing a knife across a whetstone. "You knew Amos personal?" she asked. "I knew men he paid. That is not the same answer. It's the one I've got tonight." She should have left it there. Instead she said, "If you're here because you owe my father, say that. But don't sit in my house sharpening steel and expect me to trust a silence that looks this much like guilt." The blade stopped. In the lamplight the scar near his mouth went white. "Your father kept me from hanging 12 years ago," he said. "I was riding guard on a payroll coach. The man who hired us planned the robbery too. 2 guards died. I rode with the wrong men, though I didn't fire the shot. Your father testified to what he saw. Told the judge a man who had a chance to kill a witness and didn't take it might still choose a different road." Clementine stood with her hands braced against the table. "Been trying to prove him right ever since," Eli said. It was not innocence. It was not an excuse. It was only the truth, laid on the table without asking to be polished. At the sink she said quietly, "A person can spend so long paying for one bad season, they forget there are years after it." When she looked back, his silence felt less like hiding and more like listening. The next morning, he took her across the property to show him every wash, ravine, and blind slope. She rode ahead on her sorrel mare, rifle slung across her back. He noticed how she checked wind before cresting a rise, and how she studied ground before crossing it. "You track?" he asked by the river. "Enough." "Enough for what?" "For knowing there were 2 men in the lower pasture yesterday and only 1 horse." He looked at her more closely. "Why didn't you tell me? I didn't know whether you were one of them." That almost brought a smile. They found the answer in a thicket above the south draw, brush flattened into a watchbed, cigarette ash tucked under leaves, and a clean view of the back door. Eli crouched beside her. Their shoulders touched as he pointed to the ground. 2 men, he said. "Different heels." She turned too fast and nearly struck his cheek. He caught her elbow, steadying her. The touch lasted no more than a second, but it stayed with her all the way back to the house. "Near the barn," he said. "If this turns ugly, you take your father east through the creek bed." "And leave you?" "Yes, no." He reined in. That wasn't a request. She stepped close enough that her horse shifted at the heap between them. "Then hear my answer anyway. I buried my mother here. I've watched sickness hollow out my father while neighbors crossed the road to avoid a debt they were glad wasn't theirs. I won't run from my own land, because one rich coward thinks fear is the same as authority." He studied her for a long moment. "Bravery and bad math are cousins, Miss Vale. Then count again. You are not the only one standing between Amos Reddick and my family." That evening Gideon worsened. Fever took him hard and quick. While Eli brewed willow bark tea and cooled cloths at the pump, Clementine sat with her father in the parlor. His grip on her wrist was weak, but his eyes were clear. "If Saturday goes bad," he whispered, "the deed copy's in the blue Bible under your mother's shawl. Don't let Reddick burn the record. Nothing's going bad." He gave her the look parents give brave lies. "The land matters. But not like you do." After midnight the fever broke enough for him to sleep. Clementine stepped onto the porch. The cold touched her through every seam. Eli sat on the top step with a shotgun across his knees, and the stars burned hard above the pasture. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you. I've had less for worse reasons." She leaned against the post. "Did you ever have a family?" He was quiet so long she thought he might not answer. Then he rubbed his thumb over the shotgun stock and said, "A wife, and a little boy." The words opened something in the night. "What happened?" "Men came looking to settle something with me while I was away. They found the wrong house." Clementine closed her eyes for a moment. "I'm sorry, so am I," he said. "Every day." She understood then that his tiredness was not weariness at all. It was grief after it had learned to stand up and walk around in a man's clothes. He spoke so quietly she barely heard him. "The grave doesn't care if a man meant well. It only cares what got buried." That line followed her back inside and stayed with her until dawn. By Friday afternoon the waiting ended. A boy from the Wilkes place rode in white with fear and shouted from the yard that 3 men had cut his uncle's fence. They said, "Saturday's too generous. he panted. Amos is coming tonight. The easy path lay open before Clementine then. Load the wagon. Take Gideon east while there was still light. Fight later over papers instead of blood. Eli told her exactly that. We can get him out now, he said. You, your father, the deed, enough supplies for 3 days. Live first, be stubborn later. She looked toward the river bend, silver in the late light, and toward the porch where her mother used to shell peas on summer evenings. If they left tonight, Amos would take the ranch without showing his face. And after them would come the Wilkses, then Widow Harper, then any family too tired to hold a line alone. If we leave, she said, he wins before he has earned it. That was the harder choice. She knew it. So did Eli. What would you have done in her place? Taken the road and trusted Outlaw to remember justice? Or stayed where your dead were buried and made your stand there? Most hearts know the answer before the mind dares say it aloud. Eli drew one long breath. Then we hold. They turned the house into a fortress made of ordinary things. Flour sacks under windows, buckets by each door. Ammunition split between kitchen, porch chest, and loft. Clementine drove the cattle to the far pasture to keep them clear of the yard. Eli marked angles from the barn roof and moved like a man measuring weather by instinct. Just after sunset, Gideon insisted on being carried to the parlor settee where he could see the front door. If the devil's coming, he rasped, I'd rather not hear about it second-hand. The first shot shattered the lantern by the gate. Then the night burst wide open. Horses, shouts, a rifle crack from the ridge. Eli yanked Clementine down behind the porch rail as splinters flew from the frame where her head had been a heartbeat earlier. South rise, he snapped. 2 shooters. She crawled to the kitchen window, breath sawing her throat. A muzzle flash flared by the smokehouse. She fired and heard a man curse. In the parlor, Gideon dragged his old Spencer into place and muttered, about time. Eli moved through the yard with brutal economy. Porch to trough to hitch rail. 1 shot, then another. No waste, no shouting, just the practiced speed of a man who knew hesitation buried people. A rider burst through the side gate toward the barn. Clementine missed him. Eli did not. The man fell screaming into the mud. Then a voice cut across the gunfire. Mercer, Reddick says, walk away and the girl lives. Stay, and we burn the house with the old man in it. Eli froze behind the trough, only for a second, but Clementine saw it. The old wound, the terrible fear that anybody he guarded would die because of him. The voice came again. Men like you don't get families. You know how this ends. A shot tore bark from the porch post beside her hand. Clementine looked toward Eli and saw him half-turned from the house, jaw locked, as if wrestling a ghost in the dark. Eli, she shouted. His head snapped toward her. This isn't your old grave. Something in his face broke loose. He rose and fired twice. The taunting voice cut off. Then he crossed the yard under gunfire and dropped beside her at the porch, breathing hard. No, he said. It isn't. They held together after that. A lantern smashed against the siding, and flame licked up the boards. Clementine threw down her rifle, seized a bucket, and doused it while Eli covered her with the shotgun. Gideon shot a man trying the back door. The body dropped out of sight. Then, in the middle of all that noise, Amos Reddick rode into the yard, not from the road. From the rear orchard, where only a man familiar with the land would know the ground stayed flat after rain. Gideon saw him and went white. Marauder, he rasped. I knew it. Amos sat broad and easy in the saddle, silver watch chain bright against black wool. He was older than Clementine had imagined, and handsome in the ruinous way some cruel men are made smooth by money and rotten by certainty. Should have sold when I offered fair, he called through the broken window. Gideon dragged himself upright. You burned my lease office in Casper because I wouldn't sign with you. Business hardens a man, Amos said. Eli's voice went flat. You were on the Missouri payroll road too. For the first time Amos looked surprised. Mercer, I heard the rope missed you. The whole old pattern snapped into place then. The robbery, the dead guards, the testimony. Amos had spent years buying distance from his own crimes with other men's guilt. He drew his revolver and aimed not at Eli, but at Clementine. Last chance Vale, deed for the girl. Before Gideon could answer, hoofbeats thundered beyond the fence line. Not rescue from nowhere. Consequence. At Clementine's urging, the Wilkes boy had ridden not only to warn neighbors, but to every family Amos had cheated, threatened, or tried to starve off their land. Now lanterns appeared down the dark road like a string of waking stars. Ranchers, 2 miners from Bitter Pass, Widow Harper with her dead husband's rifle across her lap. Men and women too ordinary for Amos ever to have feared until they came together. His hired guns broke first. One ran for the trees, another dropped his weapon. Amos wheeled his horse for the orchard. Clementine snatched the lariat from the porch nail and ran into the mud. She threw. The loop caught Amos across the chest and trapped one arm. His horse lunged. Pain tore through her shoulder, but she wrapped the rope around the water pump post and held. Amos was ripped from the saddle and slammed into the yard hard enough to lose both breath and gun. Eli was on him before the mud settled. Not to kill, to stop. He drove Amos face first into the ground and pinned both arms back, while the man spat threats about courts, sheriffs, and money. All the old powers, all the old lies. This time, they sounded small. Sheriff Dole arrived late and full of excuses, only to find half the county in the Vale yard. Gideon named every threat. Eli named the Missouri job and the men Amos had paid through others. Widow Harper told what had been done to her husband. The Wilkes boy repeated the warning. There was too much truth standing in one place for Outlaw to step over it clean. By dawn, Amos Reddick was in irons in his own wagon, and the strong box, taken from his buckboard, held ledgers thick with bribes, false notes, and land seizures. Men who worshipped control always keep receipts. The quiet after violence is never truly quiet. It hums in the bones. When the neighbors finally rode out and Sheriff Dole took Amos to county lockup with honesty sweating through his collar, the ranch fell into a pale, exhausted mourning. Smoke lifted from the scorched siding. Mud dried in cracked plates across the yard. A calf bawled for breakfast as if the world had not changed in the night. Gideon slept at last. Clementine found Eli in the barn washing blood from his hands. There was a crease along his upper arm where a bullet had torn cloth and skin. "You're hit, just grazed. Sit. I've had worse," which is not the same as needing less. He obeyed. She cleaned the wound with whiskey and hot water while dawn striped through the slats. He hissed once when she pressed the cloth down. Her hands began to shake then, not from fear, but from the release of it. "You can stop being made of iron for a minute," he said softly. "So can you." He gave a worn half-laugh. "Don't rightly remember how." She tied the bandage and left her hand there a second longer than necessary. The barn smelled of hay, horsehide, and whiskey. Outside, wind moved through the cottonwoods like water over stone. "My mother used to say a person isn't healed by being spared the wound," Clementine said. "They're healed when somebody finally sees where it hurts." His eyes lifted to hers, stripped of all the hard, practical distance he wore like a coat. "I saw where it hurt in you the first day," he said. "Didn't expect you'd look back." That was the moment. Not the shooting, not the capture. This small, stunned honesty in a barn still smelling of smoke. She kissed him once, gently, as if asking a question she was not sure life would let her ask twice. He answered by not letting fear decide for him. "If this story is moving you, you are exactly who it was meant to find. A like and a subscribe is one quiet way of telling us to keep making room for stories where the overlooked are finally held in the light." They sat beside each other in the hay-streaked dawn, the new thing between them warm and frightening and real. At last Eli said, "When this is settled in town, I'll head out." Clementine drew back enough to study his face. "Will you? Safer for you. There you go again, deciding what danger counts. People tied to me have died. So have people tied to Amos Reddick, and no one ever praised him for leaving." She leaned against the stall rail. "Listen to me. Grief is not a vow a person has to keep forever." He stared at his hands. "You make it sound simple. I make it sound possible." The town work moved faster than Amos expected and slower than everyone else wished. Yet his power cracked everywhere at once. The ledgers from his wagon matched old rumors too well to ignore. Fraud, bribery, extortion, arson by hired men. Even Sheriff Dole began speaking like a man trying to choose the smallest part his sentence. Within a week, the Territorial Bank froze Amos's accounts. Within a month, his grand ranch house was auctioned to pay damages. Families got land back. Widow Harper received enough restitution to keep her place. The Wilkses rebuilt their fence with lumber paid for by court order. The riverbend stayed where it had always belonged, in Vale hands. Justice, when it comes late, is rarely graceful. But it is beautiful all the same. Eli rode with Clementine and Gideon to Casper to testify. In court, Amos tried once to catch Eli's eye with that same bought smile. Eli did not return it. He gave his testimony plainly, and plain truth has a force ornament never will. When the judge ordered Amos held pending full trial, the man who had ruled half the county by fear looked suddenly what he was, an aging bully in a fine coat with no one left to carry his sins for him. On the ride home, Gideon slept in the wagon, while Clementine guided the team. Eli rode alongside through grass, just beginning to turn gold. "My father likes you," she said. "That makes one of us. He does not waste gratitude. Or daughters." Eli glanced across. Meaning, if you intend to vanish in the night for my own good, you should reconsider. I shoot straighter now." That brought the first full smile she had seen from him. It changed his whole face, took years off it. "I don't know how to stay," he said. "Then learn," she told him. "Same as the rest of us." The practical world rebuilt itself around them. Neighbors came to raise a new gate and stayed for supper. The scorched siding was replaced. Gideon's cough eased enough that he could sit on the porch again at sunset, with a blanket over his knees and a cup of coffee warming both hands. The sheriff was removed pending trial, and his young deputy proved an honest badge did not, in fact, cause a rash. Eli meant to leave twice. Once after the first fence was mended, once after Gideon could walk to the barn unaided. Both times something held him: the colt that needed gentling, the roof that needed patching, Clementine's voice carrying across the yard as if his name belonged there. Then one evening Gideon sat beside him by the shed and asked the question neither of them had put into words. "You love her?" Eli looked out across the pasture where Clementine was walking the fence in amber light. "Yes." "Then stop acting like love is a thing that happens only to luckier men." Eli's gaze stayed on her. "I'm not sure I know how to deserve her." Gideon coughed, softer now. "No one's handed deserving. We build it, board by board, day by day." That night Eli found Clementine at the river bend Amos had nearly stolen. Fireflies stitched green light through the reeds. Water ran low and clear over stone. "I have no fine speech," he said. "Good. I'd mistrust it from you. I can offer work, honesty, a man who leaves the gate better latched than he found it. I can offer the truth, even when it makes me look poor in it. And I can offer this: I walked alone so long, I forgot a home is not a place you deserve first. It's a place you protect once it lets you in." Her eyes shone even as she smiled. That sounded suspiciously like a fine speech. "Then don't tell anybody." She laid her hand against his chest. "Stay." So he did. By the time snow touched the high peaks again, Amos Reddick had been convicted on fraud, conspiracy, bribery, arson through hired agents, and attempted violent seizure of property. His holdings were broken apart and sold. The families he had leaned on got money, land, or both. The name that once lowered voices across 3 counties became a warning told with satisfaction instead of fear. In spring, beneath a sky scrubbed clean by wind, Eli and Clementine married under the cottonwoods. Gideon watched from the porch. Neighbors brought pies, whiskey, and flowers cut from kitchen gardens. Eli wore the same coat he had arrived in, brushed and mended. Clementine wore her mother's pearl comb in her hair and mud on her hem, because perfection had never been the point. Years later, when people asked Gideon what saved the Vale place, he never started with the gunfight or the court. He said a cruel man came for his land and found a daughter who knew its worth, and an outlaw who finally believed he was allowed to guard something without losing it. On soft summer evenings, Clementine would sit on the porch steps with bread cooling on the sill, and one child laughing in the yard while another slept against Eli's shoulder. And she would think that the life waiting for you is not always the one you begged for in your grief. Sometimes it is the one that arrives after grief has finished teaching you what home should feel like. Beyond them, the pasture rolled green toward the cottonwoods, and the river caught the last light like a long ribbon of hammered gold. Next time, we'll tell the story of a preacher's widow sent to keep books at a remote cattle ranch, and the silent foreman everyone called useless, until the night he was the only man brave enough to stand between her and a hanging rope.